all of us know, Sierra Leone will be 60 years after the country became independent of British colonial rule, which took place on April 27, 1961. Now, since the country attained that independence, its political history has been dominated by two main political parties. Of course, the Sierra Leone People's Party, that is the SLPP, and the All People's Congress, which is the APC. The perception of some Sierra Leoneans, though, is that development of the country has been stagnated under the leaderships of the two political parties just named. That is what some Sierra Leoneans believe. Now, as we celebrate 60 years of our country's independence, it is very important for us to remind ourselves, especially the young folks of our country, about our history, so we understand the mistakes we may have made in the past while forging ahead into the future. Therefore, between the SLPP and the APC, let the honest political history be that the SLPP has always solved Sierra Leone's problems, while the APC has always created problems for the country. The SLPP was the first political party that created the impression on the minds of the British colonial masters that Sierra Leoneans could govern themselves by winning a landslide victory in the 1962 elections. The SLPP, under the leadership of late Esabi Tumagai, led the Sierra Leonean delegation to negotiate Sierra Leone's independence. The SLPP led the writing of the very first constitution of the country. Now, under the SLPP government between 1961 and 1967, here are some of the things that happened in the country. The economy was sound. The Sierra Leone currency was more valuable than even the US dollar. Sierra Leone was doing well in agriculture. The country was exporting rice, cocoa, coffee, palm kernel, cassava, etc., etc. There was a railway system that augmented the feeder road system, where much of the agricultural products from the countryside were transported to Freetown. So people in Freetown ate very healthy food. The country was also doing very well in the mining sector, exporting diamonds and other minerals. SLPP invested hugely in education. Teacher training colleges were built, more schools built, school feeding program well structured. The higher education was great, that other nationals had their education in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was then the Athens of West Africa. The healthcare system was great. No Sierra Leonean died of a minor sickness. That is the fact. Then, after winning the 1967 election by a tie that was broken, the APC came to power in 1968. This was due to multiple military overthrows of the government. Under the presidency of late Shaka Stevens, the APC government resorted to a politics of intimidation through political violence, burning down of homes of people they thought were their opponents. So that political intimidation and violence was the trademark of the 1973 and the 1977 elections. Political opponents to the APC at that time were arrested and jailed at Manfanta prison. Some killed, some had their homes burnt down. And so after they exhausted their political intimidation tactics and forced the political opponents to succumb to them in the 1977 elections, the APC gained enough seats in parliament to pass very critical bills. Therefore, in 1978, the APC succeeded to pass a one-party state bill in parliament. So it was only the APC now that was the sole political party of the country. That was like a communist political system. 2 years later, in 1960, Shaka Stevens took a lone decision to host the 27th conference of the Organization of African Unity. That's the OAU, which is now the AU. OAU in Freetown. Hosting the OAU conference meant spending lots of money on infrastructure, beautifying the capital city, paving the streets, installing street lights, having pipe-borne water running, and more. So though the country did not have enough money to host such a conference, Shaka Stevens ordered the governor of the Bank of Sierra Leone anyway to use all of the country's money for the hosting of the OAU conference. The conference was held successfully. Okay? Now, after the 1980 OAU conference, the country's national economy was battered, which started to have its toll on the country. There was no more money to run the healthcare system. Hospitals started to dilapidate. The socio-economic factors started to dwindle. No more money to feed the people. No electricity. No pipe-borne water, etc., etc. Educational standards started to drop tremendously. Now, as the national economic hardship continued to increase, corruption also started to increase as well. People now started to say, "Wusa yutai yukau nade edi." This then meant that everyone was supposed to try their own luck in whichever way to survive the economic hardship. Now, since all hands were not equal, some people who were close to power then amassed themselves with the wealth of the country by stealing the remainder of the country's money. The rest of the population was left to fend for themselves. Now, just after that, a rumor then started to spread all over Sierra Leone that a group of Sierra Leoneans were planning to wage a war on the country. And rightly so, on March 23, 1991, a former corporal in the Sierra Leone Army by the name of Corporal Fode Sebano Sanko announced through the BBC Focus on Africa program as a leader of the Revolutionary United Front of Sierra Leone, the RUFSL, and that he officially waged war on Sierra Leone on that day. The reasons he gave for waging the war were corruption by the APC government, which had eaten into the fabric of the country, that only the APC officials were benefiting from the country's mineral wealth, that the APC government officials were using greed, selfishness, nepotism, which were being perpetrated by them. The RUF civil war dragged on for 11 good years, killing about 50,000 Sierra Leoneans, according to the United Nations Human Rights Watch, while displacing about 2 million of our brothers and sisters. Now, the APC government ruled Sierra Leone for 24 years. That is from 1968 to 1992, when they were ousted by young military officers in a government called the National Provisional Ruling Council, the NPRC, that was headed by Captain Valentine Strasser. And so in 1996, the SLPP, headed by Dr. Ahmad Tijankaba, won the proportional election. The SLPP inherited the civil war. In 6 years, it was able to end that bloody civil war, disarmed the combatants, demobilized them, and reintegrated them back into civil society. The SLPP then went ahead and re-established government institutions, trained a new army, trained the police, refurbished schools, built new schools, built new healthcare centers, introduced the National Social Security Insurance Trust System, that's NASIT, the National Commission for Social Action, that's NACSA, etc., etc. The country returned to relative peace and calm. The economy started to get back on its footing. The country's debts were paid down to zero. Sierra Leoneans started to feel confident again in their government. And then 2007, the people of Sierra Leone decided to vote again for the APC. So the APC met a very good foundation for national development then, as the SLPP had done a very good job already. Now, in few years after they took over power, prices of commodities started to rise. The cost of living for most Sierra Leoneans was hard to afford. The price of rice, the staple food of the country, rose from 60,000 leones under the SLPP to 100,000 leones, 120,000 and upwards, and then kept rising. The cost of transportation started to rise as well. So the reputation of Sierra Leone started to dwindle, as one of the APC ministers was implicated in a drug trade where a drug plane was intercepted at the Longue International Airport. Amidst all of the above, the people decided to vote the APC into power again in 2012, even though the election was marred by a lot of malpractices. 2 years after the 2012 elections, the Ebola virus disease struck Guinea in February 2014. And in March 2014, it broke out in Liberia. These are two neighboring countries to Sierra Leone. The APC government did nothing about it in Sierra Leone to stop its entrance into the country. The disease broke out in Sierra Leone and dragged on for a year plus and killed up to 4,000 Sierra Leoneans. Now, about $14 million of the money that our international donor partners sent to the country to help with the management of the disease was embezzled by operatives in the APC government in the middle of the Ebola crisis. The APC government then created a constitutional crisis by sacking the vice president of the country to distract Sierra Leoneans from the $40 million that had been embezzled. So under the APC government, the mudslide also occurred, which was a natural disaster that could have been either stopped or managed well to avoid the death of about 800 Sierra Leoneans. The economy again faced another hardship under the APC government that forced them to introduce an austerity measure, which was not managed well. In 2018, the SLPP was voted in again, taking up the problems the APC government had created for the country again. The APC government left about approximately 2.6 billion debt, with very massive traces of corruption everywhere in the country. The SLPP government again resorted to cracking down on corruption by empowering the Anti-Corruption Commission to go after the country's monies that were stolen mainly by government operatives of the APC. Much of those monies were recovered. The SLPP also saw the need to invest in the human capital of the country through education, skill training, healthcare, and the protection of the vulnerable. It decided to invest hugely in the free quality school education by supplying 94 containers of core textbooks to pupils in government and government-assisted schools that attended pre-primary, primary, junior, and senior secondary schools across the country, including 6 million exercise books. Pay school fees for those children, pay public examination fees for those children, pay school subsidies to schools to help them to run smoothly, and more. The government has also created huge awareness on the minds of the people on the importance of education on national development. The government's health ministry has been able to manage the COVID-19 very well. Of Of course, the Energy Ministry has also been able to ensure that major parts of the country are benefiting from electricity. There is now fiscal discipline across the country and a lot more. So, fellow Sierra Leoneans, when we look at the honest history of our beloved country, we see that between the two dominant political parties, the SLPP has always solved Sierra Leone's problems, while the APC has always created problems for the country. We need to know our history so as to know how we venture into our future. Thank you for your attention.